Ladies and gentlemen, welcome along to Too Many Games. Today we have the long-awaited video in our series in Epic Armageddon, the one that everyone is waiting for, I'm sure. Today we are looking at shooting. How do you shoot? How can you destroy your enemies before they even get close to you? Is what we're going to look at today. If you are interested in Epic Armageddon, then I suggest you check out the other videos that I've released so far, going over the rules and how to play. So let's get into our video and have a look at firing our guns and our weapons at the enemy from a safe distance. Shooting. There are many actions in Epic Armageddon that will give you the opportunity to shoot your units at the enemy. Have a look at my earlier video covering actions and activations in Epic Armageddon to familiarize yourself with them if need be. This shooting will take place in the action phase of the turn, and it allows you to bring your ranged weapons to bear on the opponent. Oh, look out. We have a surprise FAQ already. That has to be a record. Let's have a look at this question straight away, this frequently asked question. Can you withhold fire for later in the turn? So do you have to fire during your action? And the answer is no. A unit either fires when its formation activates with an action that allows it to shoot or forfeits its right to shoot. If you do a double action, which lets you move twice and then fire your weapons with a -1 to hit modifier, then it must be done straight after your two moves. You cannot hold off for another point in the turn. It's either use it or lose it. Okay, so let's have a look at who you can shoot at, specifically picking a target. When a formation has the opportunity to shoot at the enemy, they nominate one enemy formation to be the target. Now, regardless of how many different units or weapons are in your shooting formation, you can only choose one enemy unit to be the target. You cannot split fire between different units. So if you have your giant Titan with 5 different weapons on it, you can only choose one target formation, even if it feels like overkill. Now, what about the direction of fire? Are you limited by which way your units can shoot, in which direction? Well, the good news is that in Epic Armageddon, most units have a 360-degree line of fire. They can shoot in any direction. If your data sheet doesn't specify a firing arc for a weapon or a unit, then it is assumed to have a 360-degree line of fire. However, some weapons have limited firing arcs. So let's have a look at these. Now, for each of these, the direction that the model is facing is important, as it will determine which direction the unit can fire and who is able to be a target. You cannot turn or move your unit and change its firing arc unless you perform a move with the unit. The first firing arc we have is the forward firing arc. This is a complete 180-degree firing arc in front of the unit. You see this quite commonly on fixed heavy weapons, on tanks and on Titans. The second is the rear firing arc, which is the opposite of the forward firing and covers a full 180 degrees behind the unit. This is not the most common to find mounted on units. Thirdly, we have the left and right firing arcs, which means the left arm could fire at 180 degrees with the center of the firing arc being directly on the left of the unit and the right being the same but out the right side. Think of arms mounted, swiveling weapons on the side of a vehicle or a unit for the side arcs. And last but not least, we have the fixed forward firing arc. This is the most restrictive firing arc with just a 90-degree firing arc towards the front of the unit. Think of these firing arcs either representing heavy, slow-turning weapons or slow-turning vehicles, perhaps in Titans, that generally can't maneuver as quickly as a smaller unit, so it's restricted in the line of fire that they have. Who can shoot? So you have your formation you've activated, and they get to shoot as part of their action. You've chosen your target formation that you want to destroy or at least maim. Now it's time to determine who can actually shoot out of all the units that you have in that formation, because not all units will be able to shoot necessarily. Thankfully, this is pretty easy to work out. A unit is able to shoot if these 3 things are all true. Firstly, the unit must be in range. Range is the distance from the unit to the enemy formation. The unit must have line of fire to at least one unit in the target formation. That is, they must be able to see one enemy unit. And lastly, the unit must not be suppressed. If a unit can meet all three of these requirements, then it can fire at the target formation with its weapons. Note that not all units in your formation have to be able to shoot. As long as one unit can, you can still fire. Let's have a look at line of fire more. Line of fire is a fancy way of saying, can your unit actually see a target unit and therefore fire at them? In order for this to be true, a straight line must be able to be drawn from the unit firing to at least one unit in the target formation. However, quite often there will be things in the way that might obscure or impede this line of fire. It is quite possible for a unit's line of fire to be blocked by trees, buildings, rubble, and the like, in which case the unit cannot see the enemy and cannot meet the requirements to fire their weapons at them. Some units may be in a piece of terrain taking cover and therefore obstructed. So to represent this, if a unit is in terrain and the line of fire you are drawing to them crosses more than 10 centimeters of the terrain, they cannot be seen. So for example, these Marines want to fire at these orc boys in a woods. The line of fire from the Marines crosses less than or equal to 10 centimeters of the woods when drawn to them. This means that they are within line of fire and they can be seen. However, in this second example, when the Marines draw a line of fire to these orc boys, they find that their line of fire does in fact cross over more than 10 centimeters of the woods terrain, so they do not have line of fire to the orc boys and cannot therefore shoot them. Lastly, on line of fire, when it comes to war engines, they actually are able to block the line of fire of units trying to fire through them when targeting another unit. This is due to their size and scale generally. However, all other units do not impede line of fire, friend or foe. Okay, so how does suppression work on units? Suppression represents a formation taking fire or casualties in the battle which have reduced their effectiveness to fight the enemy. This is tracked through the blast markers that a unit will receive that we have mentioned in previous videos. If a formation has blast markers when it fires, it has an effect on the unit's firing. Every blast marker on a formation means that one unit in range and line of fire cannot shoot. Now note, they must be in line of fire and in range, so you cannot choose a junk unit with no weapons and out of sight to take the suppression. So for each blast marker, one unit who could shoot cannot shoot. These units are referred to as suppressed. When you suppress units, you generally don't get much of a choice. In fact, you suppress your units from the back of the formation to the front of the formation, meaning that each blast marker suppresses one unit and you start suppressing them automatically from the furthest away from the enemy. So no hiding your big gun up the back of the formation in relative safety, as it might become suppressed quite easily. Let's demonstrate with an example. Here we have 6 Lehman Russ tanks who want to fire on the 4 orc boys out in the open. They've got a good chance of doing a lot of damage. However, the formation has 3 blast markers on it. This means that 3 of the Lehman Russ tanks will be suppressed and unable to shoot. So remember, suppression occurs from back to front, meaning the 3 tanks at the back cannot shoot. If 2 units are the same distance away from the enemy and one needs to be suppressed, you choose which one. So now when they shoot at the boys, it's only the front 3 Lehman Russ tanks that will shoot. 3 blast markers effectively has halved the efficacy when it comes to shooting. Suppression can be a real killer for units that rely on their firepower to get the job done. Okay, we have some FAQs arising out of this so far. Firstly, can a unit being transported be suppressed? So if you are inside a transport, a number of units in the form and a number of units need to be suppressed, can those guys inside the transport take that suppression? And the answer is fairly obvious, only if the transported units are allowed to shoot as per the transport unit's datasheet. Otherwise, they don't have a line of fire. So essentially, this follows the rule that you need to have a valid line of fire to be suppressed. So only units with a legal line of fire and range will be suppressed. Next up, Can a unit without a ranged weapon be suppressed? This one sounds pretty straightforward, but let's look at the answer. Units with a firefight, small arms weapons, may be suppressed if they are within 15 centimeters and have a line of fire. Units without a firefight and ranged weapons may not be suppressed. So this is interesting. As you become more familiar with units in Epic, you will learn that some units have weapons with a range, like a missile launcher or a las cannon, say. Some units have close combat weapons that can only be used in base contact in an assault, but there are a lot of units with small arms specified on their data sheets. This represents small firearms like bolt guns and las guns that the unit can use in an assault, but cannot use them when doing a shooting action at an opponent. We'll go over that more when we look at the assault phase in one of these videos. However, the FAQ here says that these units, even though they can't shoot their small arms as part of the shooting, as long as they have a firefight, which is their firefight value, generally coinciding with small arms being written on their data sheet, you'll notice, they can be suppressed, provided they're within that 15 centimeter range. It's not game breaking, it's just interesting, as even though they could not actually shoot legally, they can be suppressed if they're within that firefight range. So it's an interesting one, not one to be too worried about, but as we learn more, that will become more of an impact when you get into those close ranges. Okay, next up we have another question. Can a unit be suppressed if it has no enemy in the firing arc of its weapons? A simple answer for this one is no. So with no targets in the line of fire of the unit's weapons, it cannot be suppressed. Someone with a legal shot must be suppressed, is what the rule says. And our last one here for a while will be, when are units that are armed with a weapon that do not require a line of fire suppressed? Only when they are within range of a unit from the target formation. So you'll come to either love or hate it that some units do not need line of fire according to their special rules. Think of artillery. So they can be suppressed if they are in range, because line of fire doesn't mean much to them. Okay. Let's have a look at a few conventions that Epic Armageddon follows when it comes to shooting. We'll start with measuring range. A weapon is in range if any of the attacking weapon is in range of any part of the target model or a model on a stand. So we must remember that stands and bases don't mean much in Epic Armageddon. You are looking for range to be measured generally from the unit to any part of a unit in the target formation. Nothing too crazy there. Just make sure your range reaches some part of the miniature that's being targeted. Secondly, lines of fire. Epic Armageddon is a game that uses true line of sight. This means a miniature can see what a miniature could see if it was alive and real. The perspective of the model is used when determining what it can see. It's not abstracted out, and unfortunately this means you sometimes have to get your head down and have a bit of a look to see what a unit can see. It honestly isn't too much of an issue, but some people might find that a little bit different from other game systems they've played. Lastly here, something you want to put in a pre-game discussion with your opponent is the concept of pre-measuring. Basically, are you free to measure distances and ranges at any point, or is this something that can only be done after declaring to shoot or declaring your charges? This differs from person to person. I personally prefer to allow pre-measuring, as it can lead to reducing those got you moments that are a bit annoying when a tactical play might fall apart because of a few millimeters. Plus, I think it cuts down the temptation for anyone to get creative with their measuring and use sly tactics perhaps. But it's up to you and your opponent to decide before the game, can you pre-measure? So just make sure you have a bit of a chat or know that your opponent's thoughts on that. So let's move on to the steps that you need to take when shooting one formation at another. So there are 4 steps that you need to follow each time you shoot with a formation. Firstly, place a blast marker on the target formation. Every time any formation comes under fire, they take a blast marker regardless if any damage is caused. Second up, roll to hit. Thirdly, allocate any hits. Then the opponent makes their saving throws and removes casualties that did not save with their saving throw. And then lastly, place additional blast markers on the target for the casualties they suffered before checking to see if this causes the unit to break. It's a pretty simple process, but let's delve a bit deeper into each of these steps now. Firstly, place a blast marker on the target formation. The target will receive one blast marker provided there is at least one unit in the firing formation that can actually shoot at the target. So you need to have one unit that can make the shot. If all units are out of range or have line of fire blocked, then no blast marker is placed as the shot doesn't happen. And this blast marker just represents the fire keeping the heads of the enemy down. You're just firing to try and suppress them. Additional blast markers are placed only when the casualties are tallied up after the saving throws are made. So a formation receives one blast marker just for being targeted. So sometimes it's worth shooting, I would say, just to put a blast marker out on a formation, particularly if that would then cause that formation to perhaps break just from that blast marker, even if you know that you're not going to really do any damage. Okay, let's stop again and have a look at some more FAQs. So firstly, can a formation of units armed with only anti-personnel fire or AP fire at an enemy formation of armored vehicles to place a blast marker on them? So basically, are you able to use a formation just to put out suppression on enemy formations, even when they could not possibly hurt them with fire? And the answer for this one is yes, and the same holds for the reverse, basically, with AT weapons firing on infantry. This is great in my opinion. It means that most formations will have something they can do, particularly if they're under strength, and it simulates the idea of just trying to keep the enemy heads down during the fight. Okay, next up, can a formation of units armed with only small arms fire at an enemy formation to place a blast marker on them? So again, this is looking at the idea of units armed with weapons that are technically ranged weapons, but cannot make a regular shooting attack. They can only do their ranged supporting fire in assault generally. So can they declare this to place a blast marker? And the answer is no. So in this case, they are not able to fire. They cannot legally fire upon the enemy, so they cannot put that blast marker out. And lastly, in this first lot of FAQs we have here, can units that are out of range of enemy formations fire at them to place a blast marker? No. It's pretty obvious to most of us, but just in case this comes up, this could occur in a unit that is mixed with other units that can shoot, and those that can't fire, you still need a valid firing target, a valid firing unit, I should say, to cause a blast marker. The next step in the shooting procedure is rolling to hit. The the player shooting has to decide if his weapons will fire with their AP or their AT attack values, if they have both options listed in the profile. So AP stands for anti-personnel, so this is used to target infantry, and AT stands for anti-tank, so this will be used against vehicles and also war engines. You then roll a single D6 for each shot being fired. Now generally, you don't do this one die at a time, but rather group similar shots together. So for example, all AP 4+ attacks will be rolled at once, followed by all AP 6+ attacks, and then maybe AT 5+. So you try and group them together. To calculate if a shot has hit or not, you compare the value on the die that you've rolled to the score needed on the weapon profile on the unit data sheet. If the value is equal to or greater than the amount needed, you'll score a hit. So for example, an AT 4+ weapon hits on a roll of a 4, 5, or 6, and an AP 3+ weapon hits on a D6 roll of a 3, 4, 5, or 6. Okay, so let's have a look at some things that can modify your dice results when shooting, both good and bad. Firstly, just to state up, a roll of 1 before any modifications occur always counts as a miss. It doesn't matter if you could then increase it, a natural 1 as we call it, always misses. So you're to hit dice that you've rolled and modified by the following. You receive a -1 to hit modifier if the formation is shooting took a double action or a martial action Now -1 just means that you're going to subtract 1 from the results that come up on the die. Next, you'll receive a +1 to your dice results if you are performing a sustained fire action. So this will make it easier to hit your opponent because you will add 1 to the dice results. Then lastly, you will receive a -1 to hit modifier if the target is receiving cover from terrain, as we saw in our last video on terrain. Note, when targeting a formation that is partially in cover, as in some units are in cover, you can ignore this -1 to hit modifier on your dice, but then this means that any hits you score can only be placed on the units that are out in the open, and they cannot be placed in the units in cover. But this can be a very helpful tactic instead of receiving that -1 modifier. Let's have a look at an example of partially in cover just to help visualize this. So here we have a formation of 4 Lehman Russ tanks. In front of them are 3 Orc boys out in the open, marked with an A. Then there are 2 Orc boys in the woods, marked with the B. And then there are 2 more Orc boy units in the ruins, marked with a C. The Lehman Russ squad opens fire, but has some choices to make here. They can target the boys marked with an A only, if they choose. This will make it easier to score hits, as they will avoid the -1 to hit modifier from the cover. But this also means that the hits that they score can only be placed onto these 3 bases of boys. Or, instead, they can target A, B, and C if they choose. So just target the whole formation, which means that every shot will receive a -1 to hit modifier, but any hits that they do score can be allocated to all of the boys. So they're all good targets, basically. So the choice is one of, will I do enough damage to achieve my goals with the easiest shot onto the boys in the open, or do I need to take a harder shot, but potentially, it's going to do more damage overall if it works out. So that's the choice that you'll have to make it at some points, and it'll be obvious sometimes, and other times it won't be. Okay, so let's get back into some FAQs once again on the topic of firing out weapons. Can a unit armed with 2 or more of the same kind of weapon choose to fire some with their AP value and others with their AT value? So if you have the four missile launchers firing, for example, can I fire 2 with AP and 2 with AT? And the answer is yes. Thankfully, there is a flexibility that comes with shooting that allows this. Just specify and work out numbers of dice shooting AP and AT before rolling any dice, so it's clear to your opponent what's happening with the shots. Can a unit armed with a weapon with multiple shots choose to fire some shots with the AP value and others with the AT value? Okay, so similar to the last question, but this time splitting shots from a single weapon. And no, the decision to fire with AP or AT value by a weapon is for all of the shots that weapon generates. So this time you don't have that flexibility, but I think this is a good ruling personally, just to cut down on some additional mathematics that you might need to track and might get a bit confusing. Okay, let's do a couple more FAQs on shooting. If a target formation has infantry in cover and armored vehicles not in cover, will my AT to hit rolls suffer the -1 modifier? This is a good question, one to try and remember in the heat of battle. The answer for it is no, and the same holds for the situation in reverse if the AV were in cover, as in the armored vehicles, and the infantry was out of cover. This is the reason you want to try and remember it, is the cover benefits do not carry over to the different types of units, essentially, is the ruling. One base of infantry might have an effect, a modifier for AP shots, but it can't affect your AT shots because the vehicles, unless the vehicles are in cover too. So it is a good thing to try and remember, because it will just make your shots a little easier potentially. Okay, next we have, can I choose to fire some shots at units in cover, taking the -1 to hit modifier, and the rest at units out of cover? So again, this is another question on flexibility when shooting and controlling what particular shots are shot at which unit? And the answer is you may not split each type of fire like this. All AP fire from a shooting formation must take the -1 to hit modifier or not at the choice of the player. The same holds for AT and for macro weapon fire. However, the player could choose to take the -1 for one type of fire and not for the other. So this translates to say that if you have 4 AP5 plus attacks, shooting at a unit partially in cover, you choose for all of the AP5 AP shots. Do they fire at the units in the open or both the units in the open and the cover? You cannot make 2 of those AP5 plus shots into the targets in cover and 2 of them to the ones in the open. However, AP and AT and also macro weapon attacks all get this choice separately from the other types of attacks. So what you decide for AP doesn't affect your AT. You get to decide for both. Okay, so with all these modifiers, what happens when the shot seems impossible to make? With the negatives, it sometimes will mean that the score that you need before any modification on the die might actually be a 7 or more. It might make it seem impossible, but you can still achieve these results even on a single D6 roll. It will be possible to hit, and we'll go through that now. So you just need to make sure that you roll a 6 on a dice first. So if you roll your dice that needs 7 or more, any 6s that you roll, you will take those dice and you will roll them again and look at the second result that you roll on those dice. So if you need to score a 7 plus, then any 6 that you roll first, you will re-roll, and any 4 plus that comes up on those dice will mean that you've hit and you've achieved your 7 plus hit. If you need an 8 plus, it would be a 6 followed by a 5 plus on that dice. If you need a 9 plus to hit, you would have to roll a 6 first and then re-roll those dice, and any 6s that come up again would mean that you hit on a 9 plus. If you need a 10 or more to hit the opponent, then you just can't do it, and that's how you seemingly achieve the impossible up to a certain point for hitting the enemy on anything more than a 6. So after all our dice are rolled to try and score hits, and we've worked all that out, we need to allocate these hits to units and make any saving throws needed for those units. Hits scored are allocated to units in the target that are both in range and in line of fire. And you do this from front to back. So this is the opposite of how you suppress. So the closest units in the target are the ones that are hit first, essentially. This is where the distinction between AP and AT is very important too, as AP shots can only be allocated to infantry targets, and AT shots can only be allocated to vehicles or war engines. When allocating all of your hits, you must allocate 1 hit to all possible units that you can before applying any additional hits to targets that have already had a hit allocated to them. In other words, a unit can't be allocated a second hit until everyone has a hit on them, at least 1 hit on them. And similar, a unit can't take a third hit until all units that can be hit have 2 hits on them. And this carries on with 3rd, 4th, 5th hits, etc. And so once all hits have been assigned to units, we come to making our armor saves. Every unit that has been allocated at least 1 hit needs to attempt to save with an armor save roll. The unit uses the armor save value that it has for its particular type on its data sheet, or alternatively, they can use any cover save that they might be benefiting from. It's one or the other, it's not both. The number of saves that a unit needs to make is 1 per hit allocated to it. So 1 save per hit scored on it, basically. Here in our example, we have 3 Predator tanks that are facing off against 4 Lehman Russ tanks. The Predator tanks activate and fire upon the Lehman Russ tanks and manage to score a total of 6 hits against the Lehman Russes. Each tank is assigned 1 single hit, accounting for 4 of the 6 hits, and then the 2 remaining hits are then applied to the closest 2 Lehman Russes for their second hit, as demonstrated in the picture there, thereby allocating all 6 hits correctly onto the unit of Lehman Russes. Continuing on with our armor save section, to make the saves, you roll a d6 for each save that is required. You then compare this result to the unit's armor or cover save. If the result is lower than the cover save or the armor save, then the unit is destroyed and removed as a casualty. If the result is greater than or equal to the unit's armor or cover save, then the unit is saved with its armor and it remains in play. Each casualty that is removed this way causes the unit to receive a blast marker, though this is 1 per model removed, regardless of how many saves were actually failed on that model. If we go back to our example with our Predators facing off against the Lehman Russ tanks, then we remember we have 6 total armor saves that need to be made. The lead tank rolls for the 2 hits that it suffered, and a result of a 3 and a 1 are scored and are lower than the 4+ that is required by the armor save value on its data sheet. So both hits are successful in knocking out the tank and removing it from play. The next tank with 2 hits rolls 2d6 and scores a 5 and a 6, and they are successful, so we leave it in play. The rear tank makes its armor save then, and a 4+ is scored, which is once again good enough to be successful in saving, so we leave it in play. And lastly, the final tank makes his save, but alas, a 3 is not good enough to save, and the tank is also removed as a casualty. With 2 tanks being destroyed in total, we add 2 blast markers to the unit. So even though there were 3 unsuccessful saves, it's only 2 blast markers that get added. Just a side note too with the example, I know Lehman Russes have a special rule that let them re-roll their armor save, but we're not using that in this example here, just to save on any comments that might come out of that. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of other things around allocating hits. Firstly, let's talk about macro weapon hits versus normal hits. Now, we haven't covered macro weapon hits yet, and we will look at them more in the special rules section, as that is where the rules for them are located. But basically, just so you know, a macro weapon is a type of weapon that doesn't allow someone to make an armor save against it. It removes their ability to save. So when a macro weapon is used to shoot at a unit, along with regular non-macro weapons, you apply all the normal hits first. You then make the armor saves for all these hits that are needed, and you remove the casualties as normal. Then you apply the macro weapon hits to the units as per standard allocation rules. These macro weapon hits must still be allocated to units that are in a position to be hit by them. So it's easiest when it comes to allocating them just to recheck what units are left and who can receive the hits from the macro weapon attack. One more thing to mention that will make more sense after our video on assault is that macro weapon hits that are allocated during an assault can be allocated to any unit in 15 centimeters, regardless of whether or not that macro weapon attack was actually a close combat hit or a firefight hit. And the main reason for this allocation the main reason for this, is that the allocation of the normal wounds may have removed the legal targets for the close combat attack if it was a close combat attack. So this just ensures that the macro weapon attack still gets to be used properly, and they haven't been shortchanged on that. Okay, we've hit the FAQ time again, and I realize this is a pretty big video so far, so hold on guys, we're all doing great. Okay, first question, are modifiers to an armor save cumulative? For example, does a sniper hit on a unit caught in a crossfire suffer a -2 save modifier? This is referring to a couple of special rules that we will get to in due time, But basically it's saying if something affects your armor save, does it stack? And the answer is yes, all modifiers apply unless specifically stated. So just remember that modifiers stack with one another. Okay, next. If a unit suffers save modifiers so that its armor value is effectively 7+, does it still get a save? This is obviously referring to the section that we just talked about a few minutes ago with the 7+ to hit rules. And the answer is no. 7+ rolls are for hits only. So don't try and get a 7+ roll for any other type of hit in Epic Armageddon apart from a 2-hit roll. A couple more FAQs. How are hits allocated on a formation when it contains light vehicles as well as infantry or armored vehicles? So this is preempting another special rule, or rather a special unit type that we haven't looked at yet. So it might be worthwhile going over these FAQs once again after all the rules have been talked about, or you understand all of them. But a light vehicle is a unit that essentially counts as both infantry and vehicle when it comes to being hit. So it can suffer damage from both AP and AT, which is a bit of a negative. So how does it work when you're applying hits from AT and AP weapons? And so the answer is the hits must be allocated so that none are wasted, and each unit has 1 hit allocated to it before being allocated a second or third, etc., if possible. In other words, if light vehicles are with infantry, then allocate AT hits to the light vehicles before AP hits. If light vehicles are with armored vehicles, then allocate AP hits to the light vehicles before AT hits. If all 3 types are in the same formation, talk it out with your opponent. So it's a bit complex here. The main principle to take away is involve your opponent in the process, but make sure that no hits are being wasted, and still apply that principle of all units having a hit where possible before applying more to that unit, to a particular unit. Apply the hits that can only hit light vehicles to them first, I would say is what it's saying here, followed by additional hits that can cause damage to both types of units in the formation. It's complex, but it will work for the most part and shouldn't be a huge issue. Just step it through the first few times that you come across this, and it'll be much easier to understand. Okay, now we're coming to see to the part where we see what happens to the formation after the casualties have been removed. And the blast markers are added to the unit for any casualties. So you check now the surviving formation to see if the attack they've just received has broken them, or are they still in play. So after the resolution of the attack, check the blast markers on the unit to see if the target is broken. Note this is done after the attack is complete and casualties removed. So don't check halfway through, or when you know they've reached enough technically, you wait till the end. The target will break if the number of blast markers they now have on them is equal to or greater than the number of units remaining in the formation. So back to our example of the Lehman Russes being attacked. They had suffered 2 tanks being removed from the shooting from the Predators. So the number of blast markers is now equal to, well, +1 for being shot at, as we've heard. When the attack's declared, you add that on. Then there was +2 more blast markers for the units that were removed. And this gives a total of at least 3 blast markers on the unit. 3 is greater or equal to than the number of units left in the formation. So they are broken. Well, we made it once again to the end of another video in our Epic Armageddon series. Wow, what an epic video that was, looking at how shooting works in the game. I hope you got a few things out of it and that it helped you understand or refresh how it all works. As with anything, what looks complex at first will become second nature the more you play and the more you get used to doing it. But it's not over yet when it comes to shooting, and the next video in the series is going to look at barrage attacks and how they work compared to regular shooting attacks. So make sure you catch that one coming out soon. Feel free to like or subscribe if you want to see the rest of this series, and I'll try and respond to any comments that you might want to leave as well. See you next time on Too Many Games.